We have the second session coming up, blockchain and the sharing economy, where we begin to get into the meat of the technology and the applications. And it's a real pleasure to introduce as the first speaker of this section, Dr. Praphul Chandra, who's the founder of koinearth and a professor at Insofe. He works at the intersection of mechanical designs, blockchains, and machine learning. He's a professor of data science and machine learning at Insofe. He was the principal data scientist at Hewlett-Packard, where his focus was the application of machine learning techniques to solve real-world problems across multiple domains like IT, tax fraud, telecom, social network, and other networks. His background includes positions at HP Labs, Texas Instruments, undergraduate degree in electronics engineering from IIT BHU, postgraduate electrical engineering from Columbia, and a PhD from the University of London, a PhD in game theory and mechanism design from the Indian Institute of Science, which is game theory, mechanism design, and machine learning is a perfect background for blockchain applications in the IoT, machine learning, AI realm. So with that, let me introduce Praphul Chandra. Thank you.
All right, if you could switch to the slides. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to pick up where Sanshori-san left off. I'm going to talk a little bit. My first slide is going to be about transaction costs, right? It's a little bit hypothetical and geeky language, but I'm going to try and make it real by showing you how it affects us all. And then I'm going to talk about the word sharing economy. So I'm going to show you 3 examples of how blockchain applications are being deployed in the world today. One of them is in production. We have deployed it. 2 of them are in development, and we plan to take them into production later this year, right? Let's start with this, right? If you look back at the world in the last 100 years, the last century, and say what has changed from a business perspective, one of the things that you realize is that transaction costs have come down. Now, as I said, transaction costs make sense to economists. What does it mean for the average person on the street? The sea freight cost, the amount it takes to ship stuff from one place to another, has come down. The time or the cost of air travel has come down. The cost of making communication calls has come down. And these numbers have come down by 90 to 99% in the last 100 years. What this means is that we live in a globalized world today. Right? We are able to have businesses and trades across geographical boundaries. Right? That has been probably one of the central themes on how business and economics has evolved over the last 100 years, something that we talked about earlier in the day too. Right? And despite this, if you see what has enabled this big change, of course, internet has been an enabling technology. Right? The way it has reduced transaction costs is cost of information travel, cost of communications, and cost of doing transactions. And despite this technology announcement, we still see that there are certain transactions costs which continue to be very, very high. And I'll give you some examples from across the industrial sector. Right? $200 billion worth of counterfeit pharmaceutical products continue to be sold annually. Right? Despite the fact that logistics is a capital-intensive business, which includes purchases of vehicles, fuel, despite that capital expenditure, 20% of the cost in logistics continues to be processing and administration costs. This is just the paperwork to make sure that things work. Right? Another example is, if you have ever run a business, you have dealt with an invoice, the average amount that you spend on processing an invoice, very conservatively estimated, is about $10. Right? That's a ridiculously high number if you think about what you're doing. Somebody is asking you to pay some money in return for certain goods and services delivered. You are paying that money plus $10, right? Just to make sure that the invoice is correct. Right? And this is more recently, we are in a smart city conference, so I thought this was an interesting number to bring up. Despite all the talk about smart city, corruption continues unabated in the Indian sector, right? Most recently, there was a fraud of about $50 million discovered in solid waste management in Bangalore, in the delivery of solid waste management services, despite all the sensors, despite all the data, despite all the analytics, right? And that makes you think as to what is the fundamental problem which explain statistics like these. And if you think about it, you realize that here are the fundamental problems. There is lack of transparency and auditability across enterprise boundaries. Whether it's government delivering services to citizens, the lack of transparency and auditability in that. Whether it's businesses working with each other, the lack of transparency and auditability in that. The process coordination is extremely cumbersome, with armies of people sitting on both sides and trying to resolve what has actually happened. We spend enormous amount of time negotiating contracts between enterprises, but these contracts are opaque. They're written in English language, and once negotiated, they are put in a drawer and never really looked at again. So since they are opaque, their enforcement is very costly, again require either armies of humans, lawyers, and access to legal services. Fundamentally, the contracts are trying to solve the problem of misaligned incentives. Right? What is best for me is not best for my business partner. And these are the kind of things that blockchain is perfectly suited to solve. What is blockchain? 1 minute summary, it's a conglomeration of 3 technologies, a coming together of 3 technologies. Cryptography, which ensures security and auditability of data. Peer-to-peer networks, which means everybody maintains a copy of the record rather than one person maintaining a copy of the record. And game theory to align incentives. And fundamentally what this will do, we believe, is it will do 3 things. It will make information trusted. Right? All of us have heard of fake news. There's things like fake news that happen in the B2B world when a wrong invoice is generated. Right? And that's what this allows you to do. It allows you to make information trusted. It allows you to create incentives, something that Chris talked about briefly. Right? The fact that you can create incentives and align the behavior of multiple parties who are involved in a transaction is a very important aspect of the blockchain technology. Now, I know a little bit of this sounds a little bit abstract, but when I give you the examples, you will see what this means. Right? And last, of course, is the notion of smart contracts. Unfortunately, this term is a little bit of a misnomer. There's nothing really smart about smart contracts in the sense that we talk about machine learning or AI. What that term means is that instead of writing a contract in an English language, you end up writing a contract in a programming language. And what that does is that it guarantees the execution of the contract as per the terms which are written in a programming language. So a better word probably for smart contracts would be auto-executing contracts. Right? And that's what we're going to see, how these 3 technologies come together and solve some of the problems that we just talked about in the last slide. Right? Now, before I jump into that, this is what we do. I come from a company called koinearth, and there are 3 things that we focus on. The whole idea of blockchain is that you're working across boundaries, whether it's companies, whether it's business, or whether it's government engaging private contractors and citizens. The idea is, how do you build trust across organization boundaries? So the first thing that we focus on is the easy creation of groups, which are trusted and whether they're implicitly trusted because the data is secured and secured in a manner such that every party who's participating in the group trusts that. Interestingly, we also allow algorithms and machines to participate in these groups as independent entities. The second thing that we focus on is how do we build shared contracts, the smart contracts that we talk about. We have templatized smart contracts, which we can customize for different solutions. And lastly, the token part, token models and incentive mechanisms, which are used to align the incentives of multiple parties in the group. Right? That's fundamentally what we focus on. This is the layer that we work on. There's a lot of technology companies out there, and this is the way we see the world evolving. Layer 1 at the bottom is the infrastructure layer. This is where a lot of the blockchain networks will run, the hardware, if you may. Layer 2 is where a lot of the open source technologies like Ethereum and Hyperledger will work. We work on layer 3 and layer 4. Layer 3 is our platform, where we build some of the things that I showed you in the last slide. And layer 4 are the applications that we work on. We are not really tied to a domain. We work in B2B solutions, government to citizen delivery solutions, and P2P solutions. Examples of this coming up in the next few slides, right? But that's fundamentally what we do. So let me start with the application of what we do and blockchains in the sharing economy. I'm going to take the word sharing economy and interpret it in two ways. The first way I'm going to talk about the sharing economy is in asset sharing, and I'll show you what that means in the example of electrical vehicles. The second thing that I'm going to talk about is process sharing. And I'm going to talk about process sharing in the context of how, in the supply chain context, and you will see how these two things look very similar once you take the blockchain viewpoint, right? Okay, so here is the incentive for why you might want to think about something like this. If you look at the electrical vehicle charging ecology around the world, 87% of electrical vehicle chargers are privately owned, right? 70% of charging sessions last less than 3 hours. If you're outside your home charger, 70% of the charging sessions last less than 3 hours. And this is the third and probably the most interesting statistic which came out of China about 6 months ago. China has done a lot of push in installing a lot of EV charging stations. But 85% of the time, the average charging station is idle. And this is a very interesting number which starts you to force you to think about what's really going on. Just to set some context, if you look at the Uber pitch deck, when Uber started several years ago, this was their key slide, that 93% of the time, a car is unutilized. And you see a similar number coming here. 85% of the time, a charging station is unutilized. Now, what does that mean? Right, just to give you an example, I live in a community of 40 homes. There are 3 charging stations, 3 electrical vehicles, and each electrical vehicle has a charging station of its own. And the charging station gets only utilized during the night time when the car is parked in the garage. Which begs the question, what happens to the charging station during the rest of the day? And why can't other electrical vehicles charge here? And what you're talking about is an asset sharing problem. There's an asset, and it's a very interesting asset, right? The electrical vehicle charging station, if you think about it, it's underutilized and it is scarce. We have very few charging stations, and among the charging stations that we have, they are underutilized. So what's going on? How can we fix that problem? The problem fundamentally is that you don't have an incentive model to share that charging station. You don't have the backbone which enables the sharing of charging stations, right? And that's what we are working on. We are fundamentally working on a sharing economy of electrical vehicle charging. What this means is create a two-sided marketplace where EV owners, whether they are two-wheelers, whether they are bicycles, whether they are cars, are the consumers. And on the other side are EV charging stations, which are the suppliers of charging station. But don't think of them as consumers or producers of charging. Think of them as prosumers. Very likely, every person who owns an electrical vehicle also owns a charging station at their home base. Can we build an incentive system which enables them to become a producer of this EV charging so that they become an enabler of the technology also? Right? That's the fundamental idea. The idea that sharing improves asset utilization. Right? That's good for the ecosystem, that's good for the EV consumers, and that's good for the charging station providers. Right? What this effectively does from a policy perspective is that it expands the accessible footprint of charging stations. Right? It's not enough to have charging stations. Just because you have a charging station does not mean you can go and charge there. There's an economic aspect to this, and that's the part that we are trying to solve. Right? So if you look at a sharing economy, it benefits the whole ecosystem. It benefits EV owners. It benefits EV manufacturers. It benefits charging station owners. It benefits charging station manufacturers. And it infects banks and the governments. So a very clear value proposition to think about this world in this way. Right? Now, how do blockchains help here? I'm not going to go into the details, but I'm going to show you flashes of how we think about this problem. Chris mentioned about the fact that it's a trusted ledger. When you have a charging station economy with so many people involved, so many parties involved, you need a trusted ledger which records all these charging transactions. Now, you can either expect a centralized entity like Uber or Ola to come in and capture this market, or offer a decentralized solution where nobody really is an aggregator, but still this economy is enabled. Right? And that's one of the things that we think will work. You need the notion of a charging token, right? Now we know Bitcoin is a dirty word in India today, but a cryptocurrency or a crypto token does more than just cryptocurrency. It's basically a representation of value. And you can think of charging time as a representation of value. And you can create a token which gives you credits if you share your charging station with somebody else. And you need to use those credits if you want to use a charging station somewhere else. Right? The third part of this is, of course, smart contracts, which are basically the logic which enable all these economics. That's the logic which is sitting behind and making sure that your accounts are correct, that you pay the right amount, that what happens if you book and cancel, what have you book and overcharge, and so on and so forth. Right? So that's one of the solutions that I wanted to show you from a real-world perspective of how blockchains can solve the charging problem or the charging infrastructure problem for the adoption of electrical vehicles. Right? The second example I wanted to share with you today, this is something that we have actually built and deployed. This is running. This is deployed today in central India, close to Nagpur, where a consortium of 26 companies is using it. Right? And as Chris was saying, this is not just fantasy, it's happening. In this case, we have thought about process sharing. Right? And what this is being used for is in the supply chain. It's a 3-tier supply chain of 26 companies. We are expanding this to include a 5-tier supply chain with a consortium of 50 companies this year. Right? But what it is fundamentally is a problem of process sharing, right? In the domain of contract manufacturing, right? So this is a solution which we built. Before we went in, I cannot share the data of the company that we have deployed it with, but this is in public domain. This is actually Toyota's supply chain network, right? This is about 2,000 companies that Toyota buys from. But what is interesting is that these companies buy from each other. So it's not a supply chain. It is, in fact, a supply network where people are buying from each other all the time, right? Now, the first message is, if you have worked in the supply chain domain, you realize that real-world supply chains are actually complex networks which consists of suppliers, contract manufacturers, logistics providers, banks who finance this, and so on and so forth. Right? And they're often organized by regions. So for example, Toyota India supply chain might look very different from Toyota Japan supply chain because there is a dependency here on customizing the product. And there are armies of supply chain management professionals sitting there and making sure that this network actually functions. The fundamental problem that they are trying to solve, if you think about it, is that each entity, each company in this supply network actually maintains its data in silos. Each entity has an ERP system, which does very well inside the organization. But as soon as you start talking about working across organization, this fails. Now, there are technologies which have attempted to solve this. For those of you who come from the supply chain domain, you hear about EDI, electronic data interchange, which was a technology to connect ERPs, but it has had very limited success. The reason it has had limited success is because the only thing that they focused on was on data interconnection. But what we are talking about is process interconnection or process sharing. So I will differ with Chris slightly. It is not just data sharing. Smart contracts are also process sharing because they embed the logic under which transactions should happen. And that's what it does. It enables you to share not only data, but processes, right? And what this does is, if you think about your procurement contracts, your purchase orders, your delivery orders as contracts, because it is in fact a contract. You're promising to pay somebody a certain amount of money if they deliver a good or service. And if you think about the procurement contracts and model them as smart contracts, then suddenly this thing which looks like a network starts to look like this, where there's nobody in the center, but there's everybody in the center. And that's the power of blockchains, where it's a decentralized network where everybody maintains a copy of the records, but everything is consistent, right? So what we did in the solution here was we created a shared ledger, which is of course blockchain, for securely sharing information among multiple entities. We created a shared contract and workflow engine, right? Using the notion of smart contracts, we have built a contract and workflow engine, which allows us to move these processes and workflows in the B2B space and automate them in a trusted manner between enterprises and automate payments and so on and so forth. Lastly, we are now starting to influence these companies to think about shared incentives, about the way they offer bonus and penalty terms to their suppliers and their manufacturers, right? And again, this is not an easy problem, because if you go to any company and talk about their relationship with their suppliers and vendors, you will often see scenarios where it is kind of a marriage which is just about existing. Nobody likes each other, but they continue to work with each other because that's the only way to work. And that's the problem that we are trying to solve by aligning the incentives of both the parties, right? So this is our solution deployed in production. If you are interested, talk to me after this. I'm here during the day. Happy to talk about how it benefited the primary manufacturer, how it benefited the suppliers. And the next step, of course, is to bring banks into this ecosystem, which we have not yet done. Just to give you real-world data of how this has impacted them, it has been in deployment since 1st January. And in the 3 or 4 months it has been in deployment, there has been a reduction of inventory levels of 1% across the network. And I cannot emphasize this enough. There's something that Chris also talked about. This is a team sport. We are talking about reduction of inventory levels across the 26 companies, not just one company. Okay? Reduction in inventory levels means improvement in cash flows, and that is the improvement in cash flows, or the ROI that the company has been measuring, saying what did we gain, right? I do want to talk about this last thing. If you think about the delivery of public services delivery from government to citizens, they often use private contractors, right? And the example that I gave initially in the Bangalore example was the solid waste management example, where the BWSSB is responsible for providing solid waste management, but does not do it on its own. It rather relies on an army of private contractors to deliver these services. So in this view of the world, you can again think of this as a supply chain or a network where the civic body is involved, private contractors are involved, and citizens are involved, right? So this is a solution that we have recently proposed to BWSSB on how they can use tokens and incentives and take the contracts that they have with the private contractors and make them into smart contracts to bring transparency and auditability in the delivery of public services to the citizens, right? The way we have solved this problem is by saying that citizen complaints should be more than just complaints. Citizen complaints should virtually be social audits, empowered by tokens which have the right to impact the contract between the civic body and the private contractors. What this means is that your citizens become the default auditors of the quality of public service delivery, having a direct say in how the private contractors are paid, right? That's what we have been. The idea is the same. You take the notion of a procurement order that the civic body places on the private contractors as a smart contract and build in incentives inside that. The incentives depend on performance, which is measured by citizens, right? Another example of smart contracts, trusted data, and transparency and auditability using the blockchain, right? That's where I will stop. If you have any questions, I can, depending on, I think we're running out of time. So we'll stop here, and I will have the next speaker, which, Chris, you will introduce the next speaker. And if you're interested, I'm here during the day.
So next I have the pleasure of introducing Aishwarya Raman, who's the Associate Director and Head of Research at Ola Mobility Institute. So I'm sure you know Ola. Ola, among a handful of other companies, has been leading the mobility as a service revolution. She is the Associate Director and Head of Research, Ola's research social innovation think tank. She's been associated with mobility since 2010, originally for her thesis in public transport space, and later as an entrepreneur who worked closely with auto rickshaw drivers in Chennai, Hyderabad, and Delhi, and elsewhere. She's the co-founder of Auto Raja, one of South India's earliest and largest book and auto services, mentored multiple startups, conducts workshops on entrepreneurship. She's also served as a member of the Board of Studies, Department of Sociology at MLP, at Vaishnav College for Women, University of Madras. So welcome. Thank you for joining us here today.
Thanks a lot, guys. Okay. और ये भी काम करता है ना यहाँ पे? ठीक है. Hello everyone. I'm here to talk to you about future of mobility. I know this is something that all of us since the start of the day have been discussing. I hope that my sort of entrepreneurial lens of understanding the mobility sector is helpful in today's conversation. Like Chris introduced, I'm Aishwarya. I am the head of research and associate director at Ola Mobility Institute. We are a group of urban planners, researchers, policy experts, sociologists, economists who are developing knowledge products at the intersection of mobility, innovation, and public good. Some of our recent research includes the Ease of Moving Index, which is a mobility framework that helps you analyze mobility scenarios in different cities. I see that a copy of the same's been left at every seat here. Thanks so much. We also developed a report on what women and girls want from urban mobility systems. And much more recently, a case study on the country's first multimodal electric mobility project in Nagpur. Today's presentation is divided into two parts. I will cover the shared, connected, and electric mobility perspectives from a global trend developmental analysis view, and then cover the India scenario. All of us know that the ubiquity of smartphones has ushered in a new era of mobility altogether, which is the on-demand mobility today. Consumers' changing preferences have given birth to unicorns in this mobility sector, right from your Uber in the US to Ola here, BlaBlaCar, Grab, so on and so forth. As much as a whopping $60 billion have been pumped into this sector already in the form of risk capital, and more now, given that a couple of companies have already gone public. All these mobility startups, especially the top ones, are already valued at $169 billion and counting. And some of the largest unicorns today in the mobility sector are in the US and China. What, therefore, is the situation in India? Closer home. In the second half of the year 2018, we had as many as 109 startups in the mobility ecosystem getting funded. They've raised $2.7 billion just last year in the second half. 32% of this funding went into the went directly to the mobility startups, whereas 43% of this funding went to the ecosystem. What, therefore, is the ecosystem? With increasingly fast-paced innovations in the mobility sector, we are, in fact, witnessing a change in the definition of the mobility ecosystem itself and what mobility means. For instance, across the world, we now have ride-hailing, sharing, car and bike sharing, smart parking, on-demand delivery, clean tech, electrification, autonomous mobility, multimodal solutions, mapping, telematics, connected car, vehicle-to-vehicle and vehicle-to-infrastructure communications, infotainment, fleet management, insurance 2.0 and more, all of which are constituting mobility. This begs the question on what our traditional mobility choices have been and how are they undergoing a change. Traditionally, we've of course looked at mobility as being a private mode of vehicle, be it a two-wheeler or a four-wheeler, which is offered to us by an auto dealer or an automaker. Two, public transportation itself, which is increasingly offered by governments and cities, and in some cases, we also have the private sector involved. And lastly, and much more particularly to India, auto rickshaws and taxis, which form our intermediate public transport that are also, again, offered by independent businesses, owners, or micro-entrepreneurs. What is changing, therefore, is that today we have easy access to and there is easy availability of data. We also have a new vehicle ownership concept, and we'll discuss that in just a minute. And there is also a concerted collective effort to reduce vehicular emissions and to decarbonize the entire transport sector through integration with renewable energy. And it is at this juncture where it is at this intersection, in fact, that the global opportunity to revolutionize and transform the mobility sector emerges. There are two large challenges that we've got to address. One is that of passenger kilometers traveled today, which is as high as 35 trillion kilometers the world over, and this is only set to double by 2050. Similarly, our per capita commuting delay today is as high as 50 hours a year, which too is set to double by 2050. Addressing these two challenges and reducing their socio-economic costs on the ecosystem becomes the mobility opportunity that is in front of innovators, that's also in front of cities themselves. That then leads me to perhaps presenting two lenses through which we can understand the current trends in mobility. The first lens is the needs of the consumer themselves. So what does a consumer today demand? Consumer demands that mobility have real-time information and planning, that there be digital payment interface, there be single payment interface, and there be connected transport modes to aid in urban mobility within a country like India. That therefore requires that we have an able supportive infrastructure, which we call the mobility integration infrastructure, to power such demands of our consumers. So this infrastructure includes aspects such as personal and public modes that are integrated, rapid transit stations and parking lots, e-commerce, as well as data, information, insights, and analytics. This brings us to the larger question on what changes in asset ownership we are experiencing. I call this the change from, or rather the shift from drive to ride. We have resources that are limited. This scarcity of resources is increasingly driving us to share them to maximize the utilization of these assets. This has given birth to several businesses such as Ola itself that's shifting the narrative from owning the asset to accessing the asset. This is also true in the real estate space in the form of Oyo rooms, for example, or Airbnb. This is true in the media streaming space as well, with the rise of Netflix and Amazon Prime Video. This is so in goods and services sector too, where you today do not have to buy something, but you can merely access it by renting it. Similarly, in the mobility sector as well, which we've illustrated on this slide. So the larger transition is from owning the asset, or in the mobility sector, owning the drive, to owning the ride itself. And there is abundant proof point for this, with increasing preference for and adoption towards vehicle sharing the world over. That therefore brings us to the India scenario and to sort of understand much more closely the trends in India. Mobility is the next economic revolution that's taking over the world, and India is definitely the new frontier. India is also uniquely positioned to ride the shared mobility wave, particularly given that it has low per capita vehicle ownership, and that we are already highly dependent on shared mobility. As much as 55% of all trips in the country, this is 2011 census data, is already through public transportation, including taxi cabs, autos, and non-motorized forms of mobility. Therefore, India is positioned well for a mobility transformation. Further, an abundant labor pool and low labor costs are helping India become an attractive manufacturing destination. As many as 20 million jobs are expected to be created in the mobility economy space, thanks to mobility innovations as well as a focus on Make in India. At the same time, India is also facing numerous urbanization challenges. right from concerns around road safety to increasing cost of congestion, increasing vehicular emissions, as well as a rising demand for parking. This is a common phenomenon that all of us witness in many parts of the country today. The tech hub of the country, Bengaluru, comes to a halt every single day. The cost of congestion, therefore, is affecting our productivity, huge loss to the GDP, with men and women stuck in traffic through the peak hours and losing productive hours. Platforms, therefore, are increasingly betting on connected, autonomous, shared, and electrified mobility in order to address these very challenges. The day is not far when shared mobility and autonomous and electrified could be leveraged to ease congestion in our cities and to make our cities more livable. That brings us to the to this conversation around how existing rickshaw, auto rickshaw, and bike modes are getting elevated, are becoming more consumer centric, are becoming more demand responsive, and how these solutions could therefore address the growing demand for mobility in cities themselves. So the digitization of intermediate public transport, such as auto rickshaws, cabs, as well as minibuses, is not new. It's been happening in the country for the last 8 years. What is heartening is to see that there is growing ridership for this, growing preference for this, and this sector is also able to generate and augment livelihoods in this space. Intermediate public transport and its relevance gets highlighted when we look at its use cases. IPT today serves underserved and unserved areas by public transit, offers first and last mile connectivity to public transit, is in fact a major transportation mode in your smaller cities, and offers rural mobility. The options in micromobility and shared mobility have in fact started exploding in the country, right from your public bicycle and scooter sharing on the one hand, all the way to bike taxis, auto rickshaw, taxi cabs, as well as their shared alternatives, as well as minibuses, their electric alternatives, and self-drive options. All these are abundant. There are numerous startups as well as larger actors that are involved in this today. We are therefore also witnessing how how platform approach to mobility can in fact revolutionize and transform mobility across the country. Take the example of Ola as a case. We in fact have a platform that's present in over 110 cities, caters to over 125 million users, engages over 1 million partners, completes over 1 billion rides every single day, and is increasingly now building solutions to integrate intermediate public transport with public transport directly. This is not only shared mobility that the country is pinning its hope on. We also have a large electrification agenda. The country is betting heavily on electric mobility to, of course, address its increasing import dependency, as well as increasing concerns around pollution and congestion. That brings us to Ola Mobility Institute's latest study, which looked at this case in Nagpur, which happens to be the country's first multimodal electric mobility project. This was launched by the Honorable Minister of Road Transport and Highways, as well as the Chief Minister of Maharashtra. A fleet of electric rickshaws and electric cabs were introduced in the city, and as far as early or as late as January 2019, the fleet served over 350,000 customers, clocked over 7.5 million clean kilometers, saved by 5.7 lakh liters of import-dependent fossil fuel, and reduced carbon dioxide emissions by over 1,230 tons. And this is something that the entire country is now today aspiring to scale and replicate. In Nagpur particularly, the Ola fleet had to offer several had to take initial measures to increase and drive the adoption among consumers as well as driver partners. We also had to understand the kind of vehicles we were introducing and testing on road in Nagpur. A robust charging infrastructure network had to be created, including deploying charging points in driver partners' residences, as well as setting up public charging stations that could be accessible to all and that were readily accessible to the drivers themselves. Drivers' livelihoods dependent on running the vehicle throughout, and having large idle times in terms of the 3 to 6 hours that it takes to charge a vehicle is something that you cannot introduce into the equation, lest the driver's earning get affected. That is why, building a robust charging network in any city becomes significantly very important for us. And I think this is where a lot of platforms can add value with the kind of data they have. They can work with cities to suggest where these public charging stations can go, and also ensure that these smart solutions are utilized to the optimum levels. We were also able to derive a lot of learnings from this pilot in Nagpur, which we've now made public. The first bit is that the success of e-mobility is hinged on leveraging shared mobility. This also includes a lot of your municipal and government fleets, employee transport fleets, hyperlocal delivery fleets, e-commerce fleets, so on and so forth. We definitely see that for these agencies, it's easier to not just bear the high upfront cost of electrification, but also to handle the idiosyncrasies of electrification, right from having to build a charging network and managing the fleet and the demands of the drivers themselves. The second key learning for us has been that TCO parity, which is your TCO parity between an EV and the ICE counterpart, needs to be achieved right from the beginning, and this is something that will drive EV adoption around the country. The parity is going to help us also make our EV projects financially viable, and also help introduce sunset clauses in our EV policies as well, which again is a huge determinant to encouraging an entire country to electrify its fleet. The third bit's around vehicle segment prioritization. Unlike the Western countries, we believe that in India, the smaller vehicle segments are much more prone to electrification first. This is because their TCO differential with ICE counterparts is low, and it's also easier to cover small distances in such small vehicles and control the electrification solutions that we're offering to different cities. Further, we're also recommending through our Nagpur study that incentives should be on the usage rather than the purchase of the electric vehicles. Also, batteries, for example, need to be subsidized. And battery swapping is something that's worked in Nagpur, and we see that there is merit in replicating this across the country, especially for the two-wheeler and the three-wheeler segments. So this is how we see the adoption would be driven in the country. We've already started witnessing a lot of two-wheeler startups that are offering electric solutions, and auto rickshaws and rickshaws in the form of EVs have already been prevalent in the country, and this is only bound to scale. What comes next is the is a question that is also something that Ola is considering, something that we as researchers at Ola Mobility Institute are considering. This is where we've sort of created a platform called Mission Electric that brings like-minded entities together. So you have cities, businesses, drivers, and consumers are all part of this platform. And the commitment here is to, in fact, deploy as many as 1 million electric vehicles in the next couple of years. The creation of a platform is important because we realized that electrification too is a collective sort of responsibility. We do need different parts of the puzzle to be solved for by different entities, and that's the kind of mission electric that's sort of driving OMI, which is a bunch of researchers such as me, and the country as well. With that, I'll end my presentation. If we have a minute or two, which we don't, so questions and perhaps interaction during the recess later. Thank you. My coordinates, in case anybody needs to write into me. Thanks.
Just as an aside, mobility as a service and rideshare companies will probably lead the switch to EV adoption because the economics of EVs depend on utilization, and where you can get the utilization up highest is in mobility as a service. And the reason for that is a large portion of an electric vehicle's cost is a fixed cost of the battery. A large portion of the cost of operating a ICE vehicle is the variable cost of maintenance and running it and fuel. And so we would expect to see the rideshare providers be early adopters of EV vehicles when that switches. All right, our next speaker is Tim Boz. Over a year ago, about a year and a half ago, I got an email, actually a LinkedIn request from a guy I didn't know who said, hey, I see you work at Toyota. I'm working with Toyota in Australia. I would like to talk to you about what I'm doing. And I sent him back a quick, curt response saying, I retired from Toyota 2 weeks ago, can't help you. And he sent me a nice note back, what are you doing now? I said, well, I'm launching a blockchain consortium. He said, funny you should say that. What I'm doing is a blockchain company. Can we talk more? And so we started emailing back and forth. And when we launched Mobi, actually 2 weeks after that initial LinkedIn, Tim and his company, ShareRing, had decided to become founding members of Mobi. So thank you, Tim, for jumping on so quickly and being a founding member of Mobi. Tim, in addition to a number of senior positions at tech companies, is a serial entrepreneur and currently is CTO of a company called Keaz, which does blockchain access to assets and vehicles, and a company called ShareRing. I think he's a CEO of ShareRing. And I think he's going to talk more about the sharing mobility economy. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks for those kind words, Chris. Down is forward. Got it. I don't need forward. That's cool. All right, thanks. The presentation so far have been fantastic. Hopefully this can enlighten you a little bit about how blockchain connects to the sharing economy. So the approach that I've been taking is more of an experiential approach from my own personal experiences in the sharing economy. So first, a little bit about me. I was born basically with an Atari controller in my hand in 1975 and have really been addicted to technology since then. I've electrocuted myself about 30 times, pulling computers apart and forgetting to unplug them from the wall. So I guess it's literally in my blood. I started programming CPUs in the late 1980s when I was about 15 years old. I worked in IT for 24 years. My focus really moved away from the coding and the development and that side and more into the operations and program management side, because I started to get really fascinated about how people use technology and what people could do with it. And that sort of drove me to run strategy for Asia Pacific for an investment bank for a while. I helped Microsoft write their operations management framework, which is a global offering that they still have to date. That was written in around 1998, I think. But I started my first business in 2004, and it was actually a business. Initially, we were focused on tracking racehorses. So the first thing we wanted to do is track racehorses for Japan racing. I moved to Japan, we did that. That was a huge flop. But what we did is we used that technology and repurposed it to be essentially a framework or a platform for tracking vehicles. And eventually I sold that to our largest customer in 2008. And to this date, they have about 2.5 million vehicles on that same platform that we wrote back in 2004. So it's one of the largest tracking companies in the world. One of the things I did notice through that company, though, when we were doing fleet tracking, is a lot of companies would come to us and they would say, how do we manage the utilisation of our vehicles? We've got all these great reports. We know that we're only using our cars 20% of the time and stuff like that, but how do we actually manage that utilisation? So that really planted the seed for Keaz, which I'll come to shortly. After I sold this IoT business, I started like an Airbnb for motorhomes, sold that into a public company in 2012, and then started Keaz in 2013, which is basically a platform for shared mobility services. So this platform is white label. So what that means is a lot of other companies basically use it as their car sharing platform. Toyota car sharing in Australia is using the Keaz platform amongst a number of other Toyota products in Australia. The world's largest single city EV car sharing project, which is actually in Christchurch, New Zealand, they use our platform. Sacramento County use our platform for their Electrify America partnership with Volkswagen. So it's probably one of the top 10 sort of platforms for car sharing in the world. So that's still going strong. And then fast forward a few years to sharing. So to get a bit of an idea about why I started sharing, I'll have to sort of go back a few years. When I was living in Japan, one of the things that really stuck out to me was the amount of waste and the lack of utilisation of things. So you'd go out for a walk on a Saturday morning and there'd be a 12-month-old TV sitting on the nature strip that someone had discarded because they bought a new one, or the vehicle registration price went up if your car was more than 3 years old. And so people would sell a car and buy a new one, and it would be to prop up the auto manufacturing industry in Japan. And then those same vehicles that were sold were then shipped overseas and sold second-hand in Australia and New Zealand, and it was extremely inefficient. And it's something that sort of stayed with me for so long. So when we started sharing, the core goal for us around sharing was to develop a platform for the sharing economy that would actually make a difference and help people increase the utilisation of assets. So that's it. That's the background. So let's talk about what the sharing economy is, or what our view of the sharing economy is. When you think about sharing economy, generally you think Airbnb, you think about Uber, Ola, companies like that. In fact, sharing economy, as Chris said before, it should probably be called the rental economy, because all it is it's about increasing utilisation of assets by allowing other people to use these assets. So Avis Car Rentals is part of the sharing economy, believe it or not. They do single sort of rentals of vehicles, but that car is shared amongst multiple people over a period of time. So, you know, sharing economy is really a new term that's been coined since the appification or apps have allowed things like Uber and Airbnb to become very successful. So, you know, it is part of our everyday life. I guarantee probably everyone in this room has been part of or used the sharing economy in the last 24, 48 hours, somehow or in some way. But what's the current state of the sharing economy? So I mentioned Airbnb, I mentioned Uber and companies like that. What we're starting to see is that a small number of large operators are now aggregating and renting the resources of the crowd, right? So these people are intermediaries that use other people's objects or other people's things and market those to rent them out to consumers, instead of having that direct relationship between the crowd and the user. One of the issues with that is it's creating a disproportionate value model between the crowd and the users. So what happens is Airbnb, for example, takes somewhere between 30 to 40, when you add it all up, % of the actual revenue, leaving very, very little amount to the owner of those apartments. So it's a system that eventually will just break, right, unless we do something about it. So Airbnb spends more and more on marketing. The other issue with that is these traditional rental companies, like the hotels and service departments and things like that, are actually losing money because Airbnb is spending this huge amount just on marketing, and they don't have the overheads to run of what's necessary to run the property, pay the mortgage and all that sort of stuff. So the only winner in the end are these intermediary operators. You see for Uber, for example, Uber's been driving down the price or the amount of money that the drivers receive, and people have started to strike about that. So we're already starting to see the system break in that sense. So something needs to be done about that to actually create a shared value proposition between the owner and the end user, and if there's an intermediary, how that intermediary works with both sides of the equation. So how does blockchain help the sharing economy? So I'm going to look at this from more of a consumer or user experience perspective, and basically move forward there. So Chris identified before, a few others identified, the blockchain isn't about cryptocurrency. It's a dirty word in some countries. Cryptocurrencies basically provide a seamless way to have payments between people without the necessary middleman or a bank. But what they do is they do sit on blockchain technology. So blockchain can do more than that. As you've heard through the previous presentations, they hold an immutable data set across a distributed ledger of information. They also allow for distributed smart contracts or virtual machines, so distributed virtual machines that can run programmatic contracts. And also software doesn't need to be deployed or hosted on centralized servers. So the risk of anyone either hacking or bringing down those servers is much less. Blockchain can be transparent, so for public blockchains, the data on it is transparent, so anyone can view it and make sure that it adds up, basically. With the right types of blockchain, it's also infinitely scalable, both horizontally and also vertically in terms of, for sharing economy, the number of assets that you store, but also the type of assets and the things that you want to do in terms of with those assets. It's also very cheap to run, so we heard before about transaction costs going down. So running a system on a blockchain is generally cheaper than running it in a centralized server location because of the overheads required to run that. And also there's no need for intermediaries. So what I'm going to do is give you a couple of examples of projects that we're working on in the blockchain world in the sharing economy. The first is a project that we started called ShareRing. So basically, the idea behind ShareRing, what we did is we did a lot of market research and looked across various areas and categories of the sharing economy, looked at construction rental, agricultural rental, personal home rental, and travel really stood out as the one where we could fit the most categories of assets into one sort of master category, but where we had the best unique value selling propositions across those and the best value proposition. So what we basically use blockchain for our travel products, so it's simply an app that you download. It's in pilot at the moment. We're testing it with a number of aggregators and providers. But some of the benefits are a digital ID. So Chris mentioned before that one of the first projects with Mobi is a digital ID across various assets and people. So what we've done is we've made it so that when you download your app, what you can do is simply take a photo of your passport or an identity. We check to validate that identity, but we never store that ID on a central server anywhere ever. What that means is no one can hack it and take it away. And it's always in your control. So what we do is we encrypt that ID, we store it locally on your phone, and then we create a hash or a fingerprint of that ID on the blockchain to validate that, this is what the encrypted file should look like. When I check into a hotel, for example, what happens is that encrypted ID gets sent directly to that hotel, and the hotel then automatically checks on the blockchain to make sure it hasn't changed between being on my phone or being validated and going to the hotel. But the other thing that allows me to do is things like express check-in. When I go to the hotel, I don't have to hand in my passport. They don't photocopy it or anything like that because they've already got that digital ID in their system. We also automatically, for countries that require it, send the validation to the government because some hotels are required to send information to the government about that. So all of that stuff is available and already done. The beauty of this is it's fully GDPR compliant, the EU privacy measures. It's verified. It's also validated on the blockchain, but you as the user are in 100% total control of that ID. So you control it throughout the whole generation. So problems that you see on the news with some other companies being hacked and your ID being stolen and all of that sort of stuff, it doesn't happen in this situation. Other areas, there's lower foreign exchange fees through it because we use a type of cryptocurrency to actually move from, say, one fiat currency to the next. So basically, I can pay in Australian dollars and go to Thailand, and the merchant will receive Thai baht. But instead of paying up to a 5% spread on the, I'm excited like Chris was. Instead of paying a 5% spread on the FX rate, they're paying less than 1% because of the way that we basically manage those fiat currencies. Also, things like the escrow. So smart contracts can actually control the escrow process if you're doing a car rental or something like that. Flexible booking workflow. So, booking a car is very different to booking a hotel, which is very different to something else. So through these developed contracts, you can actually customize the workflow of a booking instead of relying on very fixed APIs on a server. Got to stop doing this. Very low commissions, so the intermediary doesn't necessarily always have to be there. And then it's also highly secure. The next one I'll move on to is shared mobility, because we're at a Mobi Colloquium, and also because my other company is a mobility company. So one of the things that we're doing with Keaz is investigating how blockchain can create a more flexible model and a more scalable model for what Keaz is doing. The first one, obviously, is the digital identity. So one of the great things about that is once you've done the digital identity on our platform, you could then go to any of the Keaz providers and then instantly sign up and access one of those car sharing cars within 2 to 3 minutes. So you don't need to sign up to them separately. You don't need to wait for a week for them to approve it. You can have access to this car sharing car within a couple of minutes, which is a pretty cool user experience. The other concept that we're looking at is the car as a wallet. So the car essentially having this smart contract associated with it. And let's say there's 10 owners of this car, so it's 10 people own this car. Other people use it and rent it. The money would essentially go into that car. Maybe the car holds onto some as for service costs and things like that. But then using the smart contract, it would automatically distribute the profits based on the ownership of that vehicle to those owners. The other things are instant access to the vehicle. So what we do is when you make a booking, we log that booking on the blockchain. When you go to the vehicle checks the blockchain to validate the booking and the private key that you've actually, or the public key that you've actually booked with, and then we'll give you access to that. Blockchain integrated access control. So similar to how a key fob connects to the vehicle, we're using a similar mechanism to actually store the private key or the public key for the vehicle on the blockchain, and you use a temporary private key to unlock that vehicle and gain access to it. So all of that without anyone in the middle or any sort of centralized systems needing to manage those systems. And then also analytics. So one of the really interesting things we're doing is we're starting to look at how machine learning and blockchain can work together to provide things like recommendations on where vehicles should be, where the most popular locations are, what price the vehicles should be in terms of renting them out, and things like that. So we're starting to really do a lot of work in connecting this machine learning and analytics and AI into investigating that information that's publicly available on the blockchain. So they're really interesting areas that we're sort of looking at, and from an experience perspective, what this does is it gives users a better experience. It gives you owners a better and more confident experience. And the other area I didn't mention about digital ID is for RideShare and things like Uber and that sort of stuff. What I read in the Ola report is there's some places around India where upwards of 46 or 47% of women don't trust ride-sharing services or won't take ride-sharing services because of safety issues. So one of the things that we've been proposing is to use a digital ID so that when you get in the vehicle, the driver's digital ID is actually sent to the user and then any their family or something like that for that trip. So that would actually create a safer experience because it's a more trusted experience between the and the driver. For example, in China, I've been in DD a few times, and once I was in a DD and there was a photo in the app of what this guy looks like, and I'm driving and the guy in the car was completely different. So I started asking him, I said, "Oh, is this your car?" He goes, "Oh no, I'm driving for my friend today." And he wasn't actually the licensed driver of this DD car. And it happens all the time in China. I mean, there's been some really bad reviews or reports of things that have happened there. And things like a good digital ID using blockchain technology can actually solve those problems and create a safer trip or a safer experience. So just to close, in a few short years you might not notice it, but blockchain technology will be powering the sharing economy in smart cities around the world. So one of the things, why I say you won't notice it, is blockchain will fade to the background. So what we're seeing is when you use Amazon to do shopping and stuff like that, you don't think about it and go, what sort of database does Amazon use? I wonder what sort of merchant system they use and all of that sort of stuff. That's where blockchain's going. So it's going to be something in the background, but in the foreground you'll have a much better, much safer and reliable user experience. Have I got time for questions? 4 minutes. Any questions? No questions. All right, save it till later. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tim. I mentioned earlier that 3 years ago when I was at Toyota, we did a bunch of POCs with a bunch of startups. One of them, and the problem with being a startup early on in a technology is it's very risky. It's usually started by a visionary who isn't necessarily a great business person, and so the survival rate of these startups early in technology is fairly low. So we did a startup with a pioneer, an Israeli pioneer in RideShare on a blockchain. They're not around anymore. We did a CarShare POC with a pioneer in car sharing on a blockchain with a company who also isn't around anymore. We did a insurance, usage-based insurance with another startup that also isn't around anymore. We did one more with a company that luckily is still around today, and is a great company called Ocean Protocol. The precursor that we did the startup with was called BigChainDB, and the niche we did was data sharing on a blockchain, particularly the sharing of data coming out of the sensors on vehicles, and particularly around autonomous vehicles, with the idea that you would need massive amounts of data in order to really build autonomous vehicles that could drive around in the difficult cities in the world autonomously. So BigChain became Ocean, and we're lucky enough to have Dev Pramoth from Ocean Protocol here with us today to talk about some of the information data sharing aspects. I said this was the convergence of three technologies. Hopefully, Dev will talk some about the machine learning, the AI, and the data aspect of that trifecta. So Dev, come on up. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Chris. Long ago, I was told before I start anything, just start off with a short warm-up. So I would kindly request all of you to just stand up and maybe just shake your hands and your legs and sit down again, please. Thank you. Thank you very much. So before I start, I would like to thank Mobi, koinearth, and the exhibitions group, and all of you to come here today to listen to me. The value of general intelligence AI will be greater than that of the GDP of a planet. Let me repeat that. The value of general intelligence AI will be greater than that of the GDP of our planet. What I mean, or what I'm saying is that we're nowhere close to general intelligence AI, but we can be sure in the years to come, our economy is going to be powered by AI. And the fuel is data. The market has already spoken. If you look at this slide here to the left, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, some of the biggest companies were oil companies. You had ExxonMobil, Chevron, Gazprom. But recently we've seen a new trend. We've seen technology companies move up this ladder. This is more of a literal representative of data as the new oil. I think this slide does better justice to this. On this diagram here, in 2013, we produced less than 50 zettabytes. It's just a very big number of data. But by 2025, we're almost going closer to 200 zettabytes. So as Chris mentioned, as IoTs and internet communication is increasing, we're just going to produce more and more and more data. The graph beside is a more interesting chart to look at to understand what I mean by companies are understanding the value of data. Just from 2014, we had less than 50 companies mention AI in the earnings call, and already now it's close to 200. When a company mentions AI, they basically mean they're going to go after and collect valuable data and generate value out of it. And this is a clear indicator that companies have understood the value of data and how it's going to be the most valuable resources in the decades to come. Another indication is the chart here, where there have been data-driven deals, and some of the biggest deals by Facebook acquiring WhatsApp or Microsoft acquiring LinkedIn, they're all based on the data that they can get and they can improve their products on. I'm Dev Pramoth, and today I'm going to share what we at Ocean Protocol think the new data economy is going to look like. Ocean Protocol is an open source blockchain protocol where we build an ecosystem for the data economy, and we build a tokenized service layer that securely exposes data, compute, storage, and everything around using data. And today I will share what we see the data economy to look like. At Ocean, of course, we do love good images of sea creatures, so you will see a lot of them in this presentation. So first, let me show you the opportunity in this space. Over the next decades, $10 to $15 trillion will be added to the global GDP by identifying efficiencies created by the convergence of machines, data, and analytics. I don't want to debate on this number, but we can be sure AI is going to generate a lot more value in the coming years for our economy. So this is the opportunity, but what are the challenges that lie ahead to get this opportunity? Fact one, there is a lot of data all around us. An average person produces about 1.7 MB per second by 2020. But although there's so much data all around us, less than 1% of the data is currently being analyzed. We take value out of less than 1% of the data that's around us. And very few companies can actually monetize the data they have. This picture is an interesting one. So in 2018, every minute of the day, there have been 3.8 billion Google searches, about 97 million hours of Netflix video. So these big companies are the only people who are currently monetizing from the data. So as I said, we are collecting more and more data. And like the network effects, when you collect more and more data, you get more accurate with what you can do. When Amazon knows exactly what you're buying, they know what products to offer you. So with more data, you have more accuracy. With more accuracy, it translates to more money. And this cycle goes on. So people who are getting more data, they're just going to get more powerful. The third fact, as Dr. Praphul stated before, these are valuable assets that are not currently being shared. Currently, data is stored in silos. So imagine you visited a doctor regarding something to do with your blood, and you visited another doctor to do something with your bones. Now, just your own personal health data is stored in two completely different silos, which together could actually help the doctors give you better insights. So currently, all data is stored in silos. This is my favorite fact. So there is an unreasonable effectiveness of data. In this chart here, so for the same algorithms, as you feed it more data, it gets more accurate. So when you start feeding more and more data to the same algorithm, it gets better. Here's a quote from Kai-Fu Lee. He's a pioneer in the field of AI, and he says, "The invention of deep learning means that we are moving from the age of expertise to the age of data. Training successful deep learning algorithms require computing power, technical talent, and lots of data. But of these three, it's the volume of data that will be the most important going forward." So we will be able to find technical talent and enough computing power, but it is the final one, the data, that's going to take us the furthest. So it's not who has the best algorithm that wins, but who has the most data. The final fact is there is a massive disconnect between those who have data and those who need the data. That is, data scientists, problem solvers who have the algorithms, but they have no data to feed into. So when we know there's so much data all around us, why isn't it being shared then? Well, firstly, once you have data, a company might spend millions of dollars to produce a particular set of data. But once this leaves the company through a USB stick or a breach in the firewall, the person who gets it can replicate this data infinitely at almost zero cost. So people are really afraid to lose control of what they've created. And at Ocean, we are trying to solve this data sharing problem. It is a very big claim to make, but this is where we are going towards. How can we solve the problem of data sharing? Currently, the winners, they get to store all your data. They don't tell you what they do with it. They keep it, they improve their products, and they monetize more from your data. All right, So what is the solution then? How can we share data? Well, Bitcoin, of course, is a solution to most things, and unfortunately, it's also not a very good word. But let's look at what Bitcoin has done to money. The token economy has opened up money in a way we've never imagined could be possible. Money has always been opaque, power concentrated in the governments, the reserve banks, and big banks. So this was your shadow money economy. But with the introduction of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, money has become transparent. It's become permissionless. There's no single owner. And with the token economy opening up money, there's also been an explosion of opportunities. Like your banks, you've had custodian wallets. Now you have Coinbase or Trezor or other aspects which hold this cryptocurrency acting like your bank. You have new token exchanges like Binance and other exchanges which provide the liquidity for money. And then you have mining companies which secure your cryptocurrency. So these are all the new opportunities that have exploded through the introduction of Bitcoin. And similarly, just like what happened to money with the token economy, we see the change with the data economy. Currently, we see shadowed data economy where big companies like the FANG, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, holding all your data, giving no transparency, not showing you what they're doing. And we see a movement towards a more transparent, permissionless data economy where tokens and you become the owner. But what will a token economy look like? Before I tell you what a data economy would look like, I want to address one of the most important questions though, which is, how can we unlock data? Only after unlocking data will we be able to truly utilize all the explosion of opportunities that come with opening up data. So the first challenge or the first question is to unlock data is to connect the people with the data haves with the data wants. So what I mean is there are big enterprises, NGOs, institutions with a lot of data. They have a lot of data sitting in their servers and without just sitting there like dead capital. And on the other hand, you have startups, AI experts, and data scientists who have problems to solve. They have algorithms, but they cannot create value because they don't have data to feed into their models. By intersecting these, by connecting them, we generate a lot more value, and this is where Ocean comes to play. We want to be a connecting substrate that connects data providers with data consumers. So how can we reduce the friction and create and use data marketplaces? So companies, governments, NGOs with a lot of data can have data marketplaces, put their data out, and analysts or data scientists who have problems to solve, they can access data sets they're interested in through these marketplaces. And this is what we're trying to enable. This is how we want to unlock data for solving problems. As we've seen, it could also be useful within your internal companies at consortiums and other aspects. So within departments, you can understand what data is being used, how it's being used. You can have a source of single truth, and and it all comes for free when you do it internally. Well, why blockchain? We've heard a lot about blockchain today already. Blockchain acts as a public utility network, so it's not owned by any single owner. It could be private or consortium-based. It's immutable, and it allows provenance for data. There's a traceability that can be tracked. Well, blockchain also has one more power. You can add incentives. You can get people to do what you want by rewarding tokens. You can incentivize a certain behavior within the people using the technology. So this works well when you have data that you can share with other people. What happens when it's private data? Data that you want to preserve, data that you can just not put out in the marketplace. What happens in that case? Because we can be sure that the most valuable data is private data. It's not the data which can be very public to everybody. And how do we solve this problem? Well, imagine you're a data scientist and you are researching with cancer, and you have an algorithm from one hospital, and you start training your model. to improve your model, now you want the data from all the other 10,000 hospitals, but the other hospitals will not give this to you, well, because of the privacy concerns. When you want more and more data, although your AI accuracy would increase and you could claim to save more lives, but there is a risk of privacy exploits. You don't want to give away the privacy of your patients, and you don't want them to be exploited in any sense. So how do we solve this fundamental trade-off? So what we are developing to improve, to bring AI compute to data is we allow the data to stay behind the firewall. We don't move the data out, and we take the algorithm into the data. So the modeling algorithm now moves to the data. It trains the model. It takes the value out of it, and then it comes out again. So this process can be repeated over and over. So you can move from hospital 1 to hospital 2, and your model gets trained. Eventually, it gets trained by all the 10,000 hospitals without the data actually ever leaving their own firewall. And this is decentralized federated learning. We believe by advancing decentralized federated learning, we will rapidly improve AI itself. So Ocean resolves the trade-off by bringing compute to data, by building accuracy, increasing business value, while retaining the privacy. So now let me go back and show you what are the other opportunities that will come by opening up the data economy. Just like the token economy, where we've seen different aspects, the data economy will open up a whole new set of opportunities. Firstly, like in between where we have the data science tools, we will unlock a lot more data for training. We will unlock buy-sell services via wallets, way more data for compute, provenance of data. So this will allow data scientists to have access to a whole lot more data. Like the mining services which secure your tokens, we will have a similar general mining for the data economy, which validates the asset you claim to hold, which stores them securely. Just like your data, your token wallets, you will have data wallets. So how to store this data, how to encrypt them, send it through, how to allow algorithms to run through a particular set of data. Just like your token exchanges, you will have data exchanges, people exchanging a particular set of data for another, people betting on data. So you could basically claim your particular set of data will generate so much value and raise money for that. And lastly, we're going to have a lot of last DeFi for data, so raising money on data sets. This is something we've never seen that happen before. Just like the token economy has opened up money, we believe the data economy will open up data. So as we're moving towards AI, with data silos, there's going to be a data crisis, and data democracy and freedom are at stake. So let's build and fill an ocean of data and create a new data economy with the power to the people. Thank you. Any questions? Sure.
This was a pretty heavy session. Okay. Hello? This was a pretty heavy session here, right here.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. I could understand a bit of it, but personally, till the next 5 years, I don't hear a single incident of hackers stealing money from crypto wallets. I personally won't be betting my or sharing my data to any such initiatives.
Right.
You see my point, because in spite of having blockchain, I understand that blockchain and protecting the cryptocurrency itself is a different things. But still, every month we hear some hackers stealing some millions of dollars from crypto wallets. Now what confidence as a user will I get that my private data you're talking of sharing data, you're talking of making money out of data when the whole world is talking about let's not do that. You're actually formalizing the usage of data. Of course, your intentions are correct. You are saying that anyway people are doing it, let's democratize it, right? Basically, you are saying that there are a handful of people who are selling and using your data to make money. Let's make it more, give more control to the users. But the point is, for the last decades, we trust banking system because even if somebody does a scam of 9,000 crores or whatever, at least there is a government, there's a system which is ensuring that my money is my money. In this case, a hacker comes and steals away all the money and there's no system to back it up, right? So these are some of the concerns from the end user perspective.
Sure.
How does Ocean think that it will solve this problem?
Sure.
I really like your idea of keeping the data behind the firewall and treating the model, get the model inside the firewall, and then making the model, train submodels, train the the larger model. That's a neat idea, but still,
Sure.
I'm quite apprehensive on these things.
So one of the biggest, thank you for your question and your concern. So one of the biggest challenges with blockchain from a user perspective is the adoption. Of course, we all like the idea of freedom, but once we get the responsibility to hold something ourselves, we get afraid. In terms of the user experience aspect, I think we're nowhere close. I'm afraid to hold cryptocurrencies, for sure. But when you think of a consortium-based solution for companies, as Dr. Praphul said, when you have a consortium of different suppliers, in this case, when your data can be still your own but shared, there is value added to the whole process. So from a single user private aspect of sharing data, maybe we are very behind, but if you have certain research institutes that have a lot of data on cancer reports, they can anonymize certain aspects and still share this data. And we see there will be a lot of value added when you take these approaches together. From a single user experience perspective, we're very far behind, but that's a big challenge. Right.
In those hacks that you alluded to, every one of those hacks was on a centralized server. It was on an exchange that had centralized infrastructure. The hacks didn't happen on the blockchain part of it, right? So private keys weren't stolen. None of that sort of happened. The hacks either happened because people left their private key somewhere that was easy to access, or a centralized server was badly programmed.
Right. I understand that. Yeah. The point is, those things do not matter for end users because you hear in news, doesn't matter what the reason was.
Good design and decentralization of that can reduce that happening.
So my follow-up question would be that when there are so many players already in that cryptocurrency business, how come they were stupid enough to do that? See my point? After adopting the best of the technology and then doing the best, and you have to gain customers' confidence, right? And such stupid mistakes would obviously, how do we guarantee that Ocean is not going to do such stupid, right? How do you guarantee? Who guarantees that? That is a major problem for us to adopt to that kind of model.
People are the weakest link.
Yes. Well, how do we overcome that? I don't know how.
One way to think about it differently is, like it or not, you already giving your data away.
Exactly. I understand where
Yes.
it's coming from, right?
Yeah.
You're saying that you're anyway giving data, let's make it more democratic. Let's make sure that we make money instead of Amazon or Apple making money, right? That's the essence of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but basically the
Let's
adoption
talk
of...
at the break.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hey. What's his name?
All right, so we have
Hey, Dave.
one more section.
One
before
more.
break.
One more question. May I ask? One more.
One more question. Okay.
Yep.
Do we have time for one more? Yes. Go
Is
ahead.
it fine? Okay. Am I audible? Okay. So my concern is, okay, so first of all, the idea is amazing, superb. I'm a data scientist myself, and kudos to your team for that. So my concern is related to trust. I know that on a blockchain system, you can maintain trust, But when it comes to huge amount of computation, and especially the result of that computation, how do you verify? So for example, take a case where your peers update the parameters, and you get those parameters to update your model, and a huge amount of computation is needed to get these parameters from your peers. How do you verify that those peers are honest and they give you the right parameters for that?
At the moment, there's more research on the area of checksum, where you can validate the ownership of certain data and nothing has changed. So if I expose the metadata of a data set I own, as a data scientist, you can, is it on?
Yep.
As a data scientist, you can be sure you will get the data I have exposed. But what you're asking for is how do you validate the compute? So there is proof of space, which is being researched very heavily, and we are not there yet. We're still building the very fundamental blocks where you can now share your data, give it identity, allow people in marketplace to sell and accept it. But in a year or two, we will
So at least in the POC part, you are taking that part for granted that whatever parameters your peers are giving you, they are fine, at least right now.
So this is where like the curation markets will play a big role. People can stake on data sets and compute. So it's like your Amazon ratings. You give a 4-star or 5-star, and this builds trust.
To rate your peers according to their performance. And
Right. So we do have curation incentives to do this, but exactly to validate compute on data sets is far-fetched. It's going to take more years.
So
for this.
blockchains don't solve the problem of garbage in, garbage out, right? What they can do is create data provenance so it's easier to trace back to the original golden record. And then that one-time entry of that record, right, you can create a mechanism that everybody agrees to, right, for how to update the record and or put the original record on a chain.
Yep.
So it reduces the points of failure and reduces the transaction and frictional costs by creating that provenance. It doesn't prohibit bad data from going in. Okay, so we have one more session before the lunch break. We have a panel. I'd like to call Tim back up to join the panel. We have two other panelists, Akash Gupta, who's the CEO of Mobycy, founder, India's first dockless electric scooter sharing app, chief evangelist of it as well, was responsible for building the leading electric scooter sharing venture from the ground up. Before founding Mobycy, he was with Mobi Quick as vice president and head of marketing, welcome to the panel. Lastly, Lakshna Jha, founder and CEO of sRide, who has an MBA from Columbia and more than 16 years working in organizations such as Infosys, Cognizant in India and the US. So welcome, thank you, the three of you, for joining the panel. Why don't we go, Tim, we've already heard from you and gotten your presentations. Why don't we take the other two panelists? Am I missing something? Why are the Ashim, I'm so sorry. Ashim Sharma? There you are. Okay, you came anyway, uninvited. Thank you, Tram. Okay. There you are. Sorry, it was on a separate page on my bios that I hadn't flipped to yet. So Ashim has completed a Tech with Honors at the Mechanical Engineering National Institute of Technology. Started his career at Mahindra. Worked with the team that launched the Bolero in 2007. Did an MBA at SP Jain Institute. And is joined Tata Strategic Management based out of Mumbai. Most of his work has been in automotive, logistics, engineering, new product engineering and development. Currently working on the development of industrial promotion plan with the government of the Philippines. So welcome, all of you. All right, so let me do that again. Tim, you went already, so let's give a chance to each of the three other panelists to introduce themselves and their projects. Akash, can we begin with you? Thanks.
Thank you, first of all, for giving me the opportunity to share my views here. And I know there's a nice EV Expo happening, electric mobility. In fact, the front line of the newspaper today was talking about EV two-wheelers to be the norm by 2025. So yeah, electric is on. So I'm Akash Gupta. I'm the founder and CEO of Mobycy. We are building and solving last mile micro mobility in India using electric scooters. It's an app which solves, while if anyone of you would have taken the metro, coming down to this hall is a last mile, right? That is what we try and solve. We put our scooters, which can be found on the app. There's a QR code on it. People scan the QR to unlock them, and then they ride to their last mile, park them, in these destinations which are, defined or in a dockless way, and then their job is done. Yeah, so we are building the shared electric mobility ecosystem out here. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for Mobi, Chris, and the team for having us here. I'm Lakshna Jha. I'm the CEO and founder of sRide. It's a carpooling platform. What does carpool mean, right? So people who are going in one direction, they offer their seats to other people, and people can share the seats and share the cost. So let me ask a question. I came from Gurgaon. How many of you guys came from Gurgaon? Anybody? Raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 of us, right? 5. I see a few more hands. So there was no way for us to find out that we were coming here. We could have come together. We could have shared our costs. I paid for a cab. It would have been a great networking experience. You're all smart people. I'm sure I would have learned quite a bit, especially from the data scientists up there. So yeah, so this is basically what we do, in very simple terms. We are present in all cities of India, starting from Delhi, Pune, Hyderabad, Mumbai, Bangalore, Chennai, Calcutta. We are 2 million plus registered users on our platform. This year we'll do upwards of 2 million plus rides. And as a women CEO, I'm very proud to say that 55% of our passengers, so people who are looking for rides, are women. So not only we are solving the commute problem for women, because women also have a low personal ownership of vehicles. So commuting is much more challenging for them even than others. We are also empowering women as they go through their journey of life. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I would also like to thank the organizers for giving us the opportunity to be here. I'm Ashim Sharma. I lead up the automotive and mobility space for Nomura Research Institute. We actually a consulting firm founded way back in 1965, about $4.5 billion today. And we work extensively in the field of automotive, and now as automotive is branching more into mobility solutions, so whether it's different kinds of drivetrains, electric, hybrid, gas-powered, or also the new mobility solutions that are coming to the fore, whether it's personalized mobility, shared mobility, or also in the areas of public transportation using mass transit systems.
Good. Thank you all. So let me start by asking, what do you think are the, in India, what are the biggest short-term opportunities for decentralized mobility? Somebody take a crack at it, or I'll pick somebody.
I can't.
So if I can go ahead with that, I think in India, as we saw in the morning also, when we talk of mobility and we talk about the modes that people are taking, there's a large chunk of people that are either walking or are using non-motorized transportation. All our transportation systems today have two problems. The ones who have a lot of money don't find them efficient enough, and there is also a bit of a stigma attached to it, taking that. They feel it's below their dignity to take it, so they take their own personalized transport. The other segment, which is at the bottom of the pyramid, cannot pay enough for these, and therefore they take up inefficient modes, either getting overstuffed into vans or walking and things like that. So any solution, when we talk about a shared transportation or decentralized model, must also take into account this segment of people which is actually walking or is using non-motorized transport. That way there can be a rapid scale up of the model that is implemented in the country.
See, the biggest problem that we face in mobility is that there is, it's actually very fragmented. The experience of a user in India, when you're going from point A to point B, when you're taking an Uber from your home to reach to, let's say, a bus stand or a metro station, you're parking your car. Then when you're taking a metro to reach to, let's say, a far off point, and then again you're taking maybe an auto or another vehicle to reach to your really the destination. Now this is a very fragmented experience for any user, right? And that is one big problem that we have, because out of 300 million trips which are happening in India every day, can someone guess how many trips are happening by Ola and Uber?
3 to 3.5 million.
Yeah, it's about 3 million. So 1% of India is currently using Ola or Uber to commute every day. And look at the rest. There are basis studies. Almost 20 to 25% of Indians are walking down every day to their destinations, right? And that's data published by the census. So there's so much of mobility issues that are yet to be solved. And for sure, I think that is why we are all here looking at doing that.
So the one word for that is multimodal transit. Right. Another word of it is it's a pain in the ass commute. Right. For somebody who experiences it, waiting and the uncertainty of whether the next segment is going to be there on time. What's the role in connecting the things and sensors and blockchain in making that multimodal transportation less of a pain in the ass?
So when we talk about multimodal, right, what are we talking about? We're talking about users going from point A to point B in the fastest possible and cheapest possible way, right? So from that perspective, from that perspective, whichever mode provides that, that's going to be the winner. And when we look at shared mobility, when we look at carpooling, what we are doing today, most of the users are strangers to each other. If I would have come with anybody else here, I would have been a stranger. And there, the trust is very important, and I believe that blockchain can play a very big role in building the trust for the payments, for the transactions between the users.
A few years ago, I got together with some of our researchers at Keaz and put together a bit of a plan that we codenamed it Situation-Based Algorithmic Mobility. And what it did is it looked at an individual and their requirements at any point in time and their A to B requirements, and then looked at how we could connect those dots between those A to B requirements. We started visiting that again a few months ago because of blockchain technology. So because of the ability, if you have connected vehicles, you've got bus timetables, you've got PT, you've got bus locations, scooter locations, all of those. If you've got a shared data source or a shared location that's easily available, then you can start connecting those dots and giving people the richest experience. So if you say want to plan your trip tomorrow, so 10 p.m. at night, you say I'm going to plan my trip to work tomorrow, it's probably not the best time to plan that trip. The best time to plan that trip is tomorrow as you're doing it and get live updates to see where that best mobility is. And that's, the true multimodal mobility. But it also feeds into things like in a corporation, if you have meetings in your calendar, the best multimodal mobility would actually consider the fact that you're going from here to that meeting, but you've actually got another meeting after that and you need to go there. And there's 3 other people from your company that are doing it, which should basically start looking at carpooling as well. So it's the fastest and lowest cost and most efficient way of traveling that you need to look at, and it's a big project.
Well, actually, when I look at what we are building, there are a lot of pieces. When there are assets, which are scooter itself, and then there's a lot of data which is coming out of them, which needs to be shown to different users or people or the ops teams, which needs to be worked on, whether it's about maintenance, whether it's about batteries. And then at the same time, it's the end user who needs to, find, locate, and then process, and then use, and then park. So all of this, stream of data, and the kind of, assets or tokens that we can create out of those could be, blockchain could be, a technique that can solve all of these pieces, and then this can possibly feed into a multimodal system, which is having the information from buses to carpools to cabs to scooters to metros to buses. That could be the layer that can solve all of this.
Adding to that as well is ease of use. So, great example. I go to Bangkok probably once a month. We're doing a lot of work with the government over there on a number of things. And the funny thing is, you get off the plane and you get onto the airport train, so you need to buy a ticket for that. And then I got off the airport train and got the MRT, which is the subway, and I needed to buy a separate ticket for that. And then I got off the subway and got the BTS, which is their Sky Train, and I've got a Rabbit card, which is their card. And that Rabbit card doesn't work on the subway or the bus system or anything else. So there's 3 points where I actually had to stop, line up, purchase tickets and use them. And next time I'm just going to get a cab from the airport. I mean, the user experience is so bad. Even though it was faster to catch a train, the user experience was so bad that the connectivity just doesn't work.
I think another thing that we can perhaps solve through blockchain is whether we look at Ola, Uber, or we look at the other assets that are there. There are a finite number of assets that are there. It's well known that, as we heard some time back, the aggregators, to make money, then squeeze out the drivers, and there is this whole vicious cycle that starts off. But if we can bring in what is car sharing, then you'll have more assets. The people who are putting their cars out there to share do not necessarily want to make a profit. But there's a catch there. The regulations today say that you cannot use your private car for commercial use. Therefore, if a car is sent on a sharing platform, you can only recover the costs. But then how do you figure out whether when somebody is using your car, he's only recovering the costs and not making a profit? So the government came up with an idea, you can only do 2 trips a day. Now those 2 trips could be within, say, Gurgaon, or from Gurgaon to Delhi, and therefore the kind of economics of those trips would be vastly different. But that's where I think if you have a distributed ledger and things like that, the authorities can actually see, okay, you're not making profit out of this, you're only recovering costs, and that's how this idea could actually take off in India in a much faster manner, without all the political and the regulatory hurdles and things like that. And it could also then simultaneously be linked to things like insurance, making it user-based, depending on who the user is for the car at that point in time, so on and so forth. And that would, I think, streamline a lot of these issues as well. The second part around multimodal, and I have a brief point there, we know that there are these pooled rides from the cab aggregators. But in the rush hour, even if we have to take a detour of 500 meters, that might mean 15, 20 extra minutes, and people are not willing to spend that kind of time. Therefore, some sort of a linking between 2 different modes is needed. For example, a 4-wheeler and a 2-wheeler, which is kind of synchronized, so that while you've taken for the main haul 4-wheeler, the first mile or the last mile can be with a 2-wheeler, and maybe solutions like you guys are providing out there could be integrated with this, and you could actually have a very efficient multimodal system and also promote shared things in the true sense of the term. If I'm taking an individual cab instead of driving my own car, probably I'm not contributing as much to sharing or reducing traffic. But if I'm pooling into a cab, I am actually doing that. But this kind of a multimodal solution would help that.
Yeah. So when people talk about blockchain, usually they're talking about a broad set of technologies that include smart contracts or automatic contracts and digital registries of things. I'm trying to think in order to facilitate that multimodal transportation, what pieces are critical? I would think a digital ID for both the person and the thing, a smart contract that would collect one payment for the various trips and automatically allocate it out. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so definitely like a single sign-on or digital identification is important, payment is important. Anything that builds trust is very, very important for shared mobility.
So digital identity.
Yeah.
Tokenization of the transactions as well would be necessary. I mean, blockchain facilitates in a more efficient manner connected vehicles too, so interaction between the vehicles. So you get more, and this isn't just autonomous vehicles, this is just even standard vehicles these days, so connected vehicles in blockchain.
And I think a lot of crowdsourced data can also be plugged into that in the sense that if there's, like you were saying, that you were traveling in a DD cab and the cab driver was someone else, the cab was something else, right? So if those informations can be plugged in to that, so that when the user is finally reaching to that place, he or she would know that, oh, this vehicle is actually, not having air in the tires or whatever, right? So those are the things which, if they keep getting plugged into the loop, the multimodal experience for the end user would be, the best.
Tim, you mentioned tokens. What do you see the role of tokens? The last speaker, Dev, said tokens were the superpower of blockchains, the hidden superpower of blockchains, because they allow you to influence behavior. What would be the role of tokens in this?
There's quite a few levels there. I mean, in terms of for a blockchain to run effectively, you need tokens. There needs to be a reward-based system going back to the people that are actually holding and hosting, except for private blockchains. But for public blockchains, there's a token reward system for people that are hosting those, and often that token is the transactional value of what you're doing on that blockchain. So whether it's an AI query for machine learning or something like that, there needs to be a reward for those people hosting that blockchain. So we look at tokenization in that sense with what we're developing as actually the utility of the network. So anything that's done, whether it's I've unlocked a car door, I've validated an identification, I've stored new stuff on the blockchain, I've transferred something or something like that, there would be a cost involved, and the cost is so fractional and so tiny when you compare it to other sort of centralized systems, and the tokens actually allow for that to accumulate. And they eventually they have a value at the end of the chain. Otherwise, you'll end up just with orphaned tokens that have nowhere to go.
Anyone else want to comment? Speculate on the use of tokens? What about the cost of tokens? I'm not sure sort of what it is in India. In the U.S., the cost of running something through the banking system, right, is a reasonable fraction of $1. And so small transactions don't get done. Tokens potentially allow microtransactions to be done.
Yeah, and this could become very important. Say today we don't have the infrastructure, but tomorrow if we have some things wherein you're doing a fractional charging of a vehicle on a traffic light, for example. So you're putting in a very small amount of charge, which has probably a small amount of fee associated with it. That's where if the transaction cost of that can actually come down, it'll become viable for companies to do that. But if you run it through the traditional banking system, and if there's a higher cost to that, then probably you might be spending as much on the transaction as is the revenue earned on it.
The reality of the payment systems, the traditional payment systems, is you can't charge cents for something. You just can't do it. It costs too much to go through any banking system to do that. But when you tokenize it, because the reconciliation and everything is automatic on the blockchain, there isn't an intermediary that charges a fee, and your transaction is part of a larger block, and all those tokens add up to be worth something for these people that are part of the blockchain mechanism.
Okay. So back when Praphul was showing his chart about the falling transactions costs over the last 100 years, I was thinking about that and reflecting that a lot of the business models, right, the big businesses that become successful are business models that are enabled by those falling transactions. When frictional costs are too high, business doesn't get done. It's not that it's technically impossible, right? It's that it doesn't make business sense. So as transactions costs fall with tokenization, what new business models become possible in mobility? What kinds of transactions might take place that we don't see today?
Chris, if I may add to that question.
Yeah.
And I see this as an opportunity because there are 3 shared mobility service providers sitting in the room. Right? We have Ola, we have Lakshna, and we have Akash. And I'm going to be the devil's advocate and let the cat among the pigeons here. Right? What do you guys do when you get a demand on your platform which you cannot fulfill? Are you open to passing on that demand to one of your competitors?
So yeah, I can take that tough question. Yeah. So yeah, we are very open to passing it because we think this is an ecosystem, right? Ultimately, what matters is the user experience, right? So if a user is trying to go from point A to point B and is not able to get on X or Y or Z, I think we all benefit if ultimately we can share and make that user get easily from point A to point B.
And it is in this context, I think that the Chris's question that you were asking, Chris, is very interesting. We typically think about the end user experience, and Tim has been talking about this. But I think there is an opportunity to connect these shared service providers amongst each others. And these are the transaction costs that come down. The problem in this domain, again, as you said, it's a team sport. Who does that?
Yes.
Right?
So
And we have 3 service providers here, but I don't know who does that.
It's in.
You would need an aggregator for that.
But that defeats
Well,
the whole purpose.
it's interesting that you say that. So one of the things that we do in our corporate car sharing product is when there is a vehicle that's unavailable in your office, what it does is it automatically suggests that you get an Uber instead. So it already makes sure that the user experience is, I can still get to my meeting. I don't necessarily need to do it by car. And what we're doing is expanding that and suggesting bicycles or scooters or other options to get to their meeting. And if Uber isn't available, we book it via Ola or something like that. So the thing is, all of the good shared mobility companies, they've got APIs that allow you to integrate it with it. So the aggregators, as this gentleman up there said, the aggregators are the ones that can actually make that happen. Uber won't do it. Ola
Correct.
probably won't. Yeah.
Right. So I think what your solution is coming from is saying that you need another layer, which is an app which basically acts like a tech aggregator. But that again requires cooperation of people sitting in the room for them to expose the APIs to you for that to work.
That started with GDS systems back in the mid '90s for travel to book hotels, and it's a similar situation. I mean, mobility can be aggregated just like hotel bookings or airline bookings or things like that.
Assuming that those guys are ready to cooperate, and that's why I thought, and that's where the transaction cost.
So I just want to stop and highlight, because I think that was a super interesting question. What you said was there's not only a new business model here, but there's a whole new class of business models that involve cooperation and sharing amongst competitors, right, to produce a product, right, that can be facilitated by a blockchain and smart contracts. All right, super interesting. All right, let me open it up to questions and discussion. I think this is great from the audience. Yeah.
Just following up on that, can Ocean come and do a solution for that?
Wow. All right. So
we're also doing it as part of our travel. The Travel Ring product aggregates 3 different shared mobility providers. It aggregates a heap of hotel, airline providers, and a bunch of things like that. So plugging something like Ocean in for some of the machine learning aspects to provide the best solution for the user is where there might be some real benefits there.
Well, I think the beauty of that solution will come when we can have the bus feeders and the metro feeders also, and the trains also looped into it. And while I'm talking about it, we are also hearing that there's a new mobility card that government is bringing, which can be seamless across. I don't know how things will happen.
It goes back to the same thing. Technology is there.
Yeah,
How do we bring the stakeholders together?
absolutely.
That is a small part of this that we can do a
Yeah, so this is what the SI come into play. The SI is changing into the account aggregator, the individual registrar, an offshoot of this similar, and they are putting a platform for a consortium and driving a different model, bringing all the players into the space, connecting dots and providing the end user connected services into a servitation model, actually, rather as of today what we have.
Hi, this is
My name is Shrikant, and I'm the founder of Happy Cities Labs. Just to quickly answer your question, I think it's the city administration who should lead, because it's finally the responsibility of the city to provide mobility, since they are not able to, and they're depending upon Uber, Ola, and other companies. So maybe they can take the lead in creating that kind of model. And a specific question to Akash, since you are into two-wheeler sharing platform. We have seen a lot of negative impacts of dockless scooters, right? Like things being just strewn around places. What do you think is the, is that the way, or do you think the dock full or whatever, docking stations are the only practical way a city can implement shared mobility for, specifically for two-wheelers?
So
What
I'll
is
answer
your
that.
opinion?
Yeah, good question. Thanks for that. See, where we are, we have been, we started as a pure dockless platform in India in November 2017, not as far, right? And then we learned, how can this be done in India, right? 2 months down the line, we got a concept of geofences, where we said that we can't be totally dockless, in a country like this, because there are a lot of fringe areas. And in fact, in the US and China, I think a China model didn't work out, could be because of this reason, because you can't literally be dockless because the geography is such, the areas are such. But however, I think the concept of geofences is something that can solve a lot of these problems. Start with, start serving, see, mobility always works with supply, and then you get the demand, and then you work in micro markets, hyper-local micro markets. If you're solving one market well, you can start with a few fences where you can let people, park, and then slowly grow that area. That is how we are building this. We don't allow still people to grow from, let's say, one part where we are live to literally, anywhere. We say that there are a few fences where you can go to. Those are areas where you can park. And that's where I need to start first solving. And once we have, this, the supply is huge, the comfort level is huge, the system is ingrained into the people's minds, and it's working as a, clean machine. That's when we can think of going dockless. But I think it's far from the India market perspective.
Yeah, but I also think that it's more to do with the psychology, because if I own something, I will not dare to leave it anywhere.
Yes.
Right? Because it is, I don't own that vehicle, I can choose, I can just leave it wherever I want, right? That is one thing that we have to consider. Secondly, I really think that, for me, a shared economy makes sense when the cost of ownership of that is very high, like car, for example, or houses, right, or hotel. For something as simple as a two-wheeler, which is like a cycle or e-bike, it fairly falls in the category of an affordability from the Indian context. Even if you talk of e-bikes, yes, maybe not many people will be able to buy, but by and large, people will be able to buy, because the 30, 40,000 range is not still affordable. So how do you see Indians, convincing themselves that, sharing of a two-wheeler is still economical for me, rather just buying it? Because what I'm getting at is this buying of two-wheeler solves this problem of, you can psychologically, if I own something, I won't dare to leave it wherever I want. There'll be designated spots, like parking lots kind of thing, where I will park. So just thought to leave.
See, the thought is valid, but we are talking about a 40,000 electric scooter, let's say, which is a bare minimum cost, and we are talking about serving the real India. Now, when you talk about real India, there are so many people who are on cycles. It's actually creating an entrepreneur. If you're giving him wheels and if you're giving him a little bit of power in it, he can earn a lot more than that. So I think it's a chicken and egg, where we can say that while what is the real India? Real India is not the ones who are buying cars. Real India are the ones who are either on cycles or on scooters, right? Because still there are the real India moves on two-wheelers, right? As 3 million trips out of 300 million trips happening are in Ola and Uber. So where are the others lying in the pyramid. Now on the point of ownership, I think that's where the transition could happen, that once we show that this works. So recently we've launched something like that, where we are saying that, why don't you buy an electric scooter? We use it for shared mobility. That's a concept that we've recently launched, and we've got a huge response. People are buying those. They're not using for themselves, but at least and if so many people can do that, it's a small cost, right? But they're building that behavior of shared economy.
It's also convenience and practicality. Can you imagine if everyone jumped on the train with the scooter and then brought that to their destinations just so they could use it for the last mile? It's not convenient. It just doesn't work because people won't be able to get on the train. It reduces the space in the train. So it's pure convenience is why people use it, and it's been very successful in the US. And in answer to the question about with the dockless scooters in San Francisco, what they've done is they've actually made it now a law that every scooter has to have an old style bike lock on it, and at the end of the trip, it detects whether or not they've locked it against a tree or something, and that stops drunk people in the middle of the night picking it up and throwing it in the bay and things like that, which is what the biggest problem is. So they've effectively solved that problem, and then they've also limited the number of scooters that are allowed per square mile too. So they've put sort of laws in place, and it's actually helped the industry a lot over there.
Okay. So I think we're out of time for questions, but I want to give each of you about 30 seconds to just reiterate or highlight what you thought was the most important point that was brought up, either by the audience or by the group, or the most important point that should have been brought up but wasn't. How do you want to end?
I'm going to take the opposite approach. I'm going to actually say that I'm really happy that this hasn't been a focus on autonomous vehicles. I was at a conference in Austin a few months ago, and there was so much focus on autonomous vehicles and how they're going to solve all of our problems. They're going to get cars off the roads and all of that. And then I sat through a presentation by Malcolm Gladwell. And Malcolm Gladwell takes a realist view of how he sort of sees humans interacting with each other. And he stood up and he said, autonomous vehicles are going to make traffic slower, and it's going to take longer to get to work, and there's going to be more cars on the road. And he explained why. The reason why is because if I'm in an autonomous vehicle and I can do my work and stuff like that and just ignore the traffic, I'm happy to be in that car. I can watch a movie in that car if it's a 2-hour commute. So I actually believe in that view, and I don't think it's the be-all and end-all. I think multimodal systems is exactly what we've been discussing here is the answer.
Everything has unintended consequences.
See, I think what was interesting here is the point of multimodal mobility. I think that is where everything, all roads will lead towards that, where we can actually give that experience to the user that they don't have to plan a trip day before. While they're at the moment, they get the next loop or the next coverage very seamlessly. And I think blockchain can play a huge role in building that kind of an experience with government intervention, with stakeholders and competing companies coming together to solve mobility for that last end user.
So I just want to leave everybody with the thought that in India there are 20 million cars on the road which are traveling at any point of time. So that's 60 million seats. There are 140 million bikes. So that makes it 200 million seats which are empty. The utilization of those is below 4%. We keep reminding people that every bridge takes 4 to 6 years to make, takes 400 crores to make. But what does sharing takes, right? It does take just download an app and a click of a button. We keep asking what the country is doing for us, what the city is doing for us. I would ask, what are we doing for our country? What are we doing for our city? Are we trying to share as we are commuting, as we are traveling? Thanks.
I'd also just talk about that multimodal point, and I think that was very useful. But at the same time, I think the question that you brought out around, how we could also share between, say, aggregators and balance out the demand supply, I would take it a step further and say, how do we even communicate between these services and the infrastructure? For example, say I'm taking a ride using an Ola, which is shared, or a shuttle, which is shared, and if it's dropping off passengers in the middle of the road and they have a chance of getting run over, and then they're going to take the metro, how about we communicate with DMRC, the Metro Authority, and only if they walk through the walkways and go there, they will get a discount on the metro ride, rather than just jumping across lanes, across the railings and try to make it there. That way we can also make mobility more, I would say sort of whole encompassing, even for those who are not that well off when it comes to mobility.
A great discussion. Thank you all. I think we have lunch next.
Yeah, lunch is at the end of Hall 11.
Lunch is at the end of Hall 11.
Please come back at 2.
Yes, so in a time to keep back on track, to get back on track, what time please be back here? 2 o'clock the latest. So if you can come back at 1:55, that would be great. We'll start from 2 o'clock sharp.
forgot the most important part.
Yeah.
I'm not doing my job here as moderator.
So
nearly
I'd-
as well as Brad.
Thank you, panelists and our speakers today. I would now request Chris to please felicitate all our speakers, starting from, can I have? With our panelists here. Ashim? Yeah, Ashim Sharma. Miss Lakshna. Mr. Akash Gupta. Agenda. Sorry. Mr. Tim. May I request Dr. Praphul Chandra to please be on the dais? Also request Aishwarya and Dev to please come up on the dais. Dr. Chandra? Aishwarya? Dev? Request all the speakers to please gather for a group photograph. How do we do it? Yeah, this way or in front? Please, please come. Come. Yes.